Hi everyone. Welcome to today's session. Today is the webinar about the corrosive problem of economic inequality. I'm Erica. Today I'm very happy that we have invited Ms. Janice Lao. She is a global sustainability expert to talk for us today. But before we officially start our section, would you please say hi in the chat so that we know you can hear us clearly? Hi Winnie, hi Amber. Hi Professor Uchida. Hi Helen. Hi Zhongda. Before we officially start the section, I have some reminders for you. During the section, if you have any question, you can send your question to BXAI in the chat, or you can press the raise hand button to ask us in live. Later, we'll have a Q&A section. And also, we recommend you to set your screen in side-by-side mode so that you can see the PowerPoint slides and also the faces of speakers and the other audience. And we highly recommend you to turn on your camera so that we can have a more interactive section. And now, I would like to introduce Janice to all of you. Janice is an Oxford graduate and currently the director of an international hospitality company. She is also an environmental scientist and development economist. She is multi-awarded throughout her 15-year career, most recently listed in Forbes as one of the world's top female sustainability leaders, and is the 2019 ID Sustainability Leader of the Year awardee. Please join me to welcome Janice. Janice, hi.
Hi.
And now I'll pass the time to you.
Thanks, Erica. Let me put the presentation. Yeah, can you see it? Yeah, great. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to start by talking about pizza. Hopefully it moves. Here. I'm going to talk about pizza. So imagine you bought pizza and you want to share it with your friends and you have 10 people with you. How would you divide this? And I'm guessing you want to divide it equally. You're not going to give one person pretty much majority of the pie. And then the rest of the 9 people will share this one little slice. So I'll say that again. I don't think that if you're going to have pizza with your friends that you're going to give your one friend this large pizza slice and the rest of you 9 people are going to share this one slice, because that would be absurd, right? Why would you do that? What was the point of buying the pizza in the first place? Unfortunately, this is how we have divided wealth in the world today. So the top 0.7%, who we call the ultra rich, and these are the people like the Li Ka-shings of the world, own majority of the world's wealth. Then if you look at this other slice of the pie, this is where the next top 7.5%, they're called the upper middle class. So mostly these are the people, believe it or not, are the people who earn around, in Hong Kong dollars, it's around 65,000 Hong Kong dollars a month. That would put you in this pie. I actually was surprised when I found this out. So that's around less than 10,000 US dollars a month. The rest, a lot of us actually are in the middle class, which is here, 18.5%. And then the lowest, which is 73.2% of the world's population, own this much wealth. So if you look at it, who owns the most in the economy today? The elites, or I call the top 10%, which is really this 7.5% plus the 0.7, which is less than even 10% if you think about it. They own around 87% of the world's wealth share. And that's pretty, when I found this, I was actually very surprised. So, but interestingly enough, if you look at, so my earlier question was, who owns most of the wealth in the economy? And that would be and I mentioned top 8% of the world's population owns most of the economy. Okay, the second question is, who contributes the most to the economy? And it's really odd, but it's part of this pie, the middle class, and a bit of the lower, the one at the lowest bit of the pyramid. And that's because SMEs, small medium enterprises, make up around 90% of businesses. A lot of the owners of these small medium enterprises are actually around upper middle class, and even at the lowest rung of the pyramid. A lot of them are owners of SMEs. What's even amazing is that globally, SMEs employ 50% of the world's 50% of employment. They actually contribute. They hire 50% of the world's employment, and they contribute 40% of the world's GDP. And yet they do not own majority of the world's wealth. And from as an economist, I'm just blown away that from a mathematical point of view, it just does not make sense. How is it possible that the very people who are contributing to our economy are not the ones who own most of the world's wealth? And that is a question I'm going to try to answer today, because I was very curious, and it got me into this rabbit hole and got me into really trying to understand inequality. So I'm going to start talking a bit about the inequality studies that I've been researching on for the past 3 years now. So the World Economic Forum said that the number one trend that will determine global developments over the next 10 years will be inequality. We are already seeing it with the way COVID-19 has evolved and has impacted, has not unfairly impacted different sectors of society. You know, we know that COVID doesn't discriminate if you're rich or you're poor. It doesn't know you're rich or you're poor. But unfortunately, if you are poor, there's much more likelihood that you're going to get sicker, or you're going to get sick or infected with COVID-19, just because of the structural, the way we've set up the system, the structural way we've set up the system, unfortunately infects that part of the world's, that sector. So there's two other quotes I wanted to show you. One is this economist. His name is Thomas Piketty. He is actually one of the world's foremost economists when it comes to inequality. And I'm sort of doing you a favor, because this presentation is a summary somehow of his 1,000-page book. It is so thick, and it's not for light reading. And it's I would say, when I read his book called Capital, it's basically a consolidation of economic data, and he and his research partners, they all started trying to analyze how does inequality show up in the economy, and what are its impacts. So basically, every time I do an inequality presentation, people always say to me, "Oh, are you trying to be socialist? Are you trying to be a communist?" I'm not trying to be anything. What we're saying as economists is that we as Thomas Piketty is saying, you need some inequality to grow. But extreme inequality is not only useless, but can be harmful to growth, because it reduces mobility and can lead to political captures of our democratic institutions. And then the OECD, the year after, said, when such a large group gains so little from economic growth, the social fabric frays and trust in institutions is weakened. So remember these two quotes, because I'm going to be telling a story and showing you the proof, in a way, the arguments as to why a lot of economists now think that having inequality is a huge problem for the economy. So part of Piketty's study, in his book, Capital, he actually did this research, and he looked at the rate of growth, the growth rate of top global wealth. So he looked at the people who are in the Forbes billionaires list and said, So these are these guys here. And he said, okay, from 1987 to 2013, what was the increase of the wealth from that year on year? So year on year, they were earning 6.5% year on year. From 1987 to 2013, their wealth was increasing 6.5% year on year. What was the average world income, the growth of the average world income per adult? It's 1.54% year on year. And the average wealth per adult is 2.1% year on year. So that means that the growth rate of the billionaires in the billionaires list outstripped the growth rate of the average world income per adult and the average wealth per adult. That is essentially the, I would say, the summary of, if you don't want to read the book, I can just tell you right now, spoiler alert. It's basically this formula. And Thomas Piketty is saying when R is greater than G, so R is the wealth of the top 1%. If the rate of their wealth is higher than the growth rate of the world's economy, you eventually will have inequality. So I'll repeat that. When the rate, the R, the rate of the growth of the wealth of the very rich outstrips the rate of the growth of the world economy, this is how you're going to get inequality. It makes absolute sense from a mathematical point of view. Of course, if you were a billionaire back in 1987 and your 1 billion was earning 6.5% year on year, when the rate of growth of the economy is probably 1.4% or 2.1%, guess who's going to get richer faster? Obviously, it will be the billionaires. So the billionaires become wealthier than the average citizen. So that one is simple math. And the thing is, there's a lot of misconception that we shouldn't give minimum wage increases. And this is very like a lot of politicians believe that, oh, you shouldn't keep increasing minimum wage because we are actually not helping entrepreneurs and businesses. But actually, what the data is showing is if we increase minimum wage, the GDP increases. And here's a chart showing, so this is a little hard to read, but basically, if you move, the fifth quintile are the richest. So let's say these are the top 1%, okay? The more richer they are, see how much GDP growth rate they're not contributing because it's a negative number. But if I increase the wages of the lowest, if you remember in the pie, they're the lowest, they get the smallest share of the pie. If I increase the wages of those people, look at what happens to the GDP, increases by around 0.4 percentage points. Why is that the case? And to me, and before I answer that question, the other thing I wanted to say as well is, the other problem we have with inequality is that there's a wage inequality. While we've become more productive as a population, we make more things out of less people, for example, we aren't paying for that productivity. So this is the wage index, okay? And this is the gap. This is how much productive we are as a population, and yet we are not remunerating or compensating our people adequately. So if you remember my question earlier, a lot of people, when I tell them that, it does help. I mean, there is a point where you can't just obviously keep increasing minimum wages forever. There is obviously a limit. But at this stage in the world economy, majority of countries, we haven't quite gotten to that ceiling yet. So there is still room for us to increase minimum wage to a point where it will still contribute to GDP. So before you get a bit confused by this, very simple, if there was one thing I wanted you to remember as well from this presentation, the way a capitalist system works is us buying things, us consuming, us people consuming. So how do we consume? When I have money. How do I have money? When I have work. So if I don't have enough disposable income, how am I going to be consuming? Because without consuming, there won't be an economy. And this is what we're seeing in COVID now. Because we can't go out, because we can't go travel, we can't go shopping, it's basically stopped the economic engine. And that's the same situation that happened in 2008 global financial crisis. People lost their disposable income, so they stopped buying. And when you stop buying, you don't consume. And when you don't consume, you don't contribute to the economy. So it's basically that engine, right? And so when I explain equality to people, I explain it not from, let's care for the poor people. Definitely we have to do that. But from my economic mindset, I'm thinking, in order for all of us to thrive, we have to make sure that the engine of that economy keeps running. And who is that engine? It just happens to be the middle class, because there's more people who are in the middle class, and they are the ones with, if you add if you multiply the number of the middle class multiplied by their disposable income, it is much bigger than any other class that's out there. So the thing about economic inequality, and I mentioned this already, how did we get here? We got here because, as I mentioned earlier, we are not paying wages aligned to productivity. So there's low wages despite increased productivity. And so what happens is there's relative inequality has decreased, but absolute inequality has increased. So the way I'm going to explain it is, the percentage difference between, let's say in 1987, the difference between person A and person B's salary was like maybe 10%, right? In 2020, that percentage has gone down by maybe 5%, but the absolute number hasn't. So maybe the absolute gap between person A and person B in 1987 was maybe $200, for example. That was the 10% back then. But if you remember my point about the billionaires growing by their wealth going 6.5% year on year, by 2020, that absolute number gap is no longer $200, although it's 5% gap, but that number is probably like $80,000 now, or $2,000. So the absolute difference between person A and person B has increased, but the percentage has decreased. That is a problem because we do not pay based on percentages. We pay by actual cash that we have on hand. So the less cash that person has, the less their ability to buy. And I mentioned earlier already this thing about making the rich richer lowers GDP by 0.08 percentage points. Raising poor incomes increases GDP by 0.38 percentage points. When you're richer, it just so happens that majority of the countries in the world right now have a positive tax regime if you are wealthy. And if you're wealthy, you have the ability to be able to make use of tax loopholes, which the middle class and the poor sector cannot use. Also, there's a positive tax regime for companies. So a lot of companies have the ability to list themselves in tax havens rather than pay full tax in, let's say, Europe or even in Hong Kong. If you're a poor person, it's very unlikely that you will open a bank account in Bermuda. But if you are a millionaire, a billionaire, you're likely to do that. So therefore, you can make use of those tax loopholes as opposed to if you were a middle class or a poor person. And then, because you're poor, there's a systemic lack of opportunities for minorities and the poor and the middle class. Guess who goes to who goes to Yale, who goes to Harvard? It's much more likely that you went to a really, really excellent school that happens to cost a lot of money and then eventually gives you those types of opportunities. Who doesn't get the opportunity? It's mostly the minorities and the poor and middle class. And then there are other factors in play. AI, job displacement, changing demographics. I'm not going to talk about that because that might be a bit much for this presentation. So imagine I was making a cake and I put all of these ingredients in the pot. And then I'm like making my pie or my cake. And that's how this economic inequality situation starts. And what we've learned in history is that inequality never self-corrects. In history, inequality has always been intervened. The last time inequality was intervened was World War II. And then previous to that, it was World War I. And then previous to that, some other civil war or revolution. So as human beings, we're not very good at self-correcting inequality. And I'm not saying that there will be another World War. I'm just saying is eventually something happens something happens where it then becomes this natural distribution of wealth. It's very difficult to intervene, but later on, you'll see in my presentation, I call for the fact that we have to intervene in this situation. So imagine I'm now making my cake, and I've made my cupcakes or my little pizza pies, and this is what's happened. These are the outcomes of economic inequality. One is human development lost by 22%. If you do not go to the right school or you don't get the right education, most likely what happens is your life expectancy and your income, your ability to earn money declines. And so that also means we are not able to help people live to the fullest potential. That is why should you care about someone not making their fullest potential? What if that person, if he or she went got the right opportunity, he or she could have maybe come up with a vaccine for COVID. But because they never had that opportunity, we would have never known. So when a person in the world's population doesn't meet their full potential, we all suffer from that. It's a talent issue. We're not competing with them, but they are not able to contribute their talent and their skills to the world economy. That is an issue for us. The second is economic growth lost due to because consumption power has gone down. And my great example in this situation is, yes, if you're a billionaire, you can probably billionaire or millionaire, you can probably buy 35 pieces of steak every meal time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Would you actually eat 35 pieces of steak? No. So you're only just going to be buying one because you're only one person and you're not going to eat 35. You're only going to eat one steak. So what are you going to do with the rest of your money? You save it. And the thing about saving, which is a good thing, but the thing about saving is it doesn't go back to the economic engine that I mentioned earlier. It doesn't get back to being consumed. It's not being used by other people. It has a slightly lesser impact than if you actually put it back for consumption into the economy. And then another thing that initially when I was researching and reading even the book I mentioned to you, Thomas Piketty's Capital, I was surprised by this, but I don't think we should be. Trust in government falls because a lot of people who feel like I'm working so hard. Remember my graph about I'm producing so much and yet my wages aren't increasing. And here is this small group of people who just sit there and they're earning way more money than I am. And here I am working so hard for just 1 1/100th of that amount of money. Again, human behavior shows us that there will be resentment, and with resentment, there will be rising social unrest. And I'll talk a bit about government in the next few slides. And this one is the one that worries me the most, is the decline of the middle class. As I mentioned to you, capitalism exists because there is a growing middle class. If there is a decline of the middle class, we will have a problem with me ensuring that capitalist engine keeps running. So the middle class is no longer a majority in the US since 2015, since 5 years ago. And sadly, you're much more likely to fall off the class you were born into. And so this is where the resentment comes from. Part of the reason that a lot of economists think that this is the reason why Trump won as well. A lot of white voters who used to vote Democrat moved to voting for a Republican. They voted for Obama, then they voted for Trump. And part of that is this, can you imagine what it's like? You were already middle class and suddenly you become poor. That I know in a way, if you were poor already, you're just like, oh, that's not a big problem. But for a lot of people who have to move from one class to another, it's a very jarring experience. and it causes a lot of resentment. And so there's deep inequalities among social classes and groups, and they undermine social cohesion and the legitimacy of political institutions. And here are, oh, sorry, just got too fast. Talking about the middle class, in a separate study, they found that because of inequality, so the 7 pillars of middle class society is under threat. Wage-based middle class society, if you remember earlier, I talked about the graph with productivity and the wage index, and there's a misalignment. In the past, you could be middle class and still live whatever, either the American dream or be able to live comfortably. That's no longer the case today. Wage incomes are no longer sufficient to quality of life. This is why we have the gig economy. This is why we see, even in developed countries, where people have to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to live, and they're middle class. In some countries, there is a lack of social protection. We're seeing this in a lot of cities in Asia, where housing is no longer affordable, nor is healthcare. There's a lot of educational institutions out there, but there's a lack of quality. So even if you get a university degree, if you didn't go to the right schools, you're not going to get the right jobs. And because of that, you don't go up the social mobility ladder. And without being able to go up the social mobility ladder, your belief in progress, meaning your belief that your hard work will pay off, no longer exists. That's the whole point about being in the middle class, is believing that if I work hard, I will be able to get my kids to school, I will be able to buy the car, I'll be able to buy a flat. As a middle class today, it's very unlikely you will believe this. And because of that, the middle class, you won't see moderate politics. It's either you're in one end of the spectrum, very, very liberal, or you're very, very conservative. It's very rare to find the middle class in the very middle, only because the middle class are trying to find people within the political spectrum who can help them solve these problems. And the other thing as well, I wanted to talk about education with the middle class. If you remember the thing I said about educational boom, there's a lot of educational institutions, the quality is a bit questionable. And because of that, what we're finding, we know that education is such a potent tool, a very, very important tool to equip poor families, even the middle class, to get them out of the class they're in and move them up one class higher. We're no longer seeing that because what we're seeing is, if you went to the right schools, unfortunately I went to the right school, but I was a scholar. So a lot of you are scholars, and I'm very thankful for the scholarship. But if I had waited for my parents to pay for my Oxford degree, that absolutely no way. And I am the minority. There are very, very few people who in Oxford who are scholars, as opposed to the full paying students. If you have a population of a higher population of people who are rich going to the right schools, and then a smaller population of talented people going to the right schools, what's going to happen is you create a clique, you create this almost like a system where you're not providing opportunities to the most talented in your society to go and get the best education that they can get. And that is still a problem for society. I wanted to share as well some data, just to give you a bit of an idea where some countries are. And I've used this a lot as an example. In Singapore, the income share of the top 1 and 10%, if you add the 1 and 10%, they earn 70% of Singapore's economy. The top 10% owns 70%. Own 70% of Singapore's economy. It's roughly the same for Hong Kong, 68%, and then the United States is 55%. But what's staggering is you look at housing affordability. Home ownership in Singapore is 90%. Home ownership in Hong Kong is 49.2%. And home ownership in the United States is 67.4%. And you can already see the difference between Singapore and Hong Kong. When we're talking about housing affordability in Hong Kong, it's pretty much a non-issue in Singapore, but it is an issue in Hong Kong. And if this is something that the government can sort out, it could be one of the things less that, if you remember here, that could be under threat, something that they could sort out if government can sort this out. And here, I think a lot of the scholars in Baishan are actually millennials, and probably even Gen Z. I'm so sorry, but studies are already showing that you may end up poorer than your parents. I am very, very sorry for this. I'm actually not a millennial or Gen Z. I'm actually Gen X. I just made it by 2 years. So yes, this one is the one that saddens me the most, because it was like, the whole point about being middle class is being able to give a better life to the next generation. And I'm afraid that we have not done that job for the next generation. And I think, you know, I am also an environmental scientist. So what worries me is not only are we leaving an environment that is not livable to the next generation, we have also made them more poor than us, which in those two contexts is such a shame. And we need, in my generation, we need to sort this out. We need to ensure that we give a better life for our next generation. But the reason why this is the case is the context of this generation has been shaped by financial crisis to another financial crisis. Onerous student debt, particularly if you're from the US, growing inequality, the worst employment rate since the 1930s. And because of that, I'm not surprised that they do not trust government. I am not surprised by that at all. They're living poorer than their parents. For the first time in the modern era, we risk having not one generations, but two generations that do not have a higher standard of living than their parents. That is shocking to me. Despite all the technologies we have not done a better job for the next generation. And because of that, there is a decline in absolute mobility. So actually, most of the poorer percentage people today are actually from this generation. And a lot of them have university degrees. So it's almost like we told this next generation, go and get a degree and everything's going to be fine. That's no longer the case in this economy. And the other thing, I talked about government, right? I talked about lack of trust in government. Why? Well, let's start from here, the top. People blame inequality in a lot of cases, but they mostly blame government because government can shape economic policies. And they feel like as government, whichever government, it can be, put a country, blank country government. People look at government's economic policies as the main reason for enabling this inequality to happen. So they say, okay, let's blame government, right? So what they say, okay, I'm going to blame government. Then I find out that, so I'm going to go to government and say, I blame you for the inequality that I'm experiencing right now. And then you realize no one is listening, because what we're finding is a lot of the government representation don't represent majority of these people. They represent different causes, different, they're lobbyists. And so there's a different, they don't represent most of the people are suffering because of inequality. And what they're finding is, it says extreme inequality in the concentration of capabilities and opportunities. Sorry, not this one. Weaker bargaining power. So a lot of poor and middle class people now feel like I have no bargaining power in government because my views are not represented. And because my views are not represented in this government, I am going to protest because I feel like no one is listening to me. And because of that, partly then you realize there is this narrow elite of people who are taking these opportunities that should be equitably distributed to all of us. And so because of all of these factors, majority of young people do not trust in the institutions that my generation trusts. And that's why there's often this like difference of opinions, like, why would you say this about government when government has done a great job? But for the young people, they see it differently because they have a very different experience of government than my experience of what government was like. So the thing about capitalism, if you remember my thing about the engine, what is amazing about capitalism is even if we have mathematical data, it's actually, you might need more of a psychology degree in order to understand economics, because people consume when they're confident. When they aren't confident, what do? They keep their money. And this is what's happening in COVID today, right? This is what happened in the global financial crisis. When I am not confident that I can still keep my job, I'm just going to save that money. I'm not going to consume. But the way our economic structures were built is we need people to consume. We need people to be confident in consuming. And if we take away that confidence, where did this confidence come from? And that confidence comes from the trust that these institutions give these people, the trust that, oh, if I buy today, I'm sure I will still be able to have a job. Even if I lose my job, this particular job, someone else is going to help me find another job. So there's almost like a sense of security that is now lost. Majority of the people today, I think around 70% of people today who were interviewed said, I do not have confidence that I am going to succeed in this economy. And that is shocking, because we need people to be confident in the economy in order to consume. And because of that, as I mentioned earlier, what they found is, this one I highlighted, according to the UN, one study on global data since 1945 found that a 30% increase in the size of the politically excluded population, those people who feel like they don't get a share of the world's economy, or they don't get representation in government, will boost a chance of civil war by 25%. Again, I've explained it earlier. Why is that the case? Because people feel like they have to speak out, and they don't get that through their through government representation. Okay, I'm going to move. I think this is my second to the last slide. Sorry, you can't see the yellow here, but I actually put this slide up in 2017, and people keep thinking I'm referring to a particular politician. I'm referring to no particular politician. This is just a summary, basically. When people do not trust their leaders, when there's a lack of leadership credibility, meaning the leadership has no credibility, people then don't trust institutions. And because they don't trust in institutions and the government, they have little hope for the future. This was in 2017. And it says, current populist movements are fueled by a lack of trust in the system and economic and societal fears. And some people think I'm referring to 2019. I'm not. This was 2017. This was already a study made in 2017. This was a study actually made post-Brexit, because they were trying to understand why that was the decision made by a lot of voters in the UK. And then underscoring the trust crisis is the lack of credibility of leadership. If you do not trust your leaders, you will not have trust in its institutions. And then 53% believe sorry, you can't read this, but it says the current overall system has failed them. This was in 2017, and I mentioned to you today, in 2020, this is now increased to 70%. Even the elites have a lack of faith in the system. And that is worrying, because they also have a lot of disposable income, and there's a lot of them. There are more of them than the top 1%. As I said again, without trust, financial markets cannot function and capitalism could collapse. What is this trust? Trust in government, for example. The trust in government is basically this pyramid, right? First, you have to start from empathy. A lot of voters or a lot of citizens don't think that their leaders understand what it's like to be in their shoes. Like when you come up with a policy like that, did you even think how this is going to impact on me individually? as a middle-class person, a lot of government officials are perceived to not have empathy. And because they don't have empathy, or perceive that they don't have empathy, people then think that they're not authentic. Is this who you really are? Or you're just saying this so that you can get my vote. So they start being suspicious about people's intention and motivation. And then after that, you come up with a plan. But because if you don't have empathy, you don't understand what it's like to be these people suffering from inequality, how are you going to make a plan that makes sense to solve the problem? So it's that three-pronged thing in order to make that trust. And already, if you have a political system and politicians with no empathy, you're not going to get authenticity or logic at all, and therefore you won't have trust. And as I said here, only 1 in 5 believe the system is working for them. So basically just means 4 in 5 believe the system is not working for them. Again, that's a problem. So I'm towards my last 2 slides. I didn't want to be totally negative today. So sorry, I know you already we're already thinking about COVID so much, and that's quite negative already. So there are some solutions to this. We need to modernize the social contract. We need to change the way we work. We use technology. We need to provide support to families in order to get women working and getting them to be more productive. We also need to do a radical overhaul of the social safety net. We must ensure that we provide enough pension, unemployment insurance, and sick leave. Improve conditions for workers, like predictable schedules, portable benefits, living wages, but also creating fair tax policies, enhancing status of women in the workplace, and providing opportunities to historically marginalized communities. These are not my recommendations. So if you're interested, this is actually a blog post by one of the foremost think tanks on sustainability, BSR, and you can just link, I've actually hyperlinked, so you can go and read through that. My thing is, business has to be in service to humanity. A lot of policies today are made so that business could thrive, and yet we forget, why does business need to thrive? It is not just to make a profit. Business today seems to be serving itself and not humanity, and we're forgetting that the economy is made up of people, not of profit and loss statements, not of share prices, not of stock prices, not of, what is the Hang Seng Index. It is made for people. And it's almost like we forgot that. And because we've forgotten that, there is this inequality problem. So I think that's it. And I'm happy to answer your questions. I think there were already some questions, but Erica, if you want to help me with them.
Thank you, Janice. We actually received 4 questions from the audience, and some of them would like to ask live. How about we now invite Minju No? Are you here? Would you please unmute yourself and ask your question here? Minju? Hello, Minju, you have to unmute yourself. Hi, hello.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Janice. I'm Miju. I'm currently working for UN Environment Program in Mexico as a volunteer. And so my question was regarding relationship between economic inequality, change, and sustainability, as you are one of the leading experts in the theme of sustainability and also in the theme of sustainable tourism, which I'm very interested.
So, yeah, I think I actually had your written question. So it says, how are the issues of income inequality and the issues of climate change and environmental sustainability interlinked? And how can we help solve both at the same time? I think, again, as you can see in the screen, I think if businesses are already thinking much more outside of just the profit box that they're usually used to thinking. But if we can I think it really starts from businesses understanding that without the environment, meaning without the places where they can get their resources, and without people who are buying and making these things, there is no business. So if they can start, if that is their starting point, then we can actually solve a lot of the world's problems, from climate change to inequality, because now we're saying there's a value to nature. At the moment, we don't have a value for nature, and that's why we just keep using it as if it will be there forever. We know this is not the case. And then the second, we just assume, because we use the terms consumer instead of people, or staff instead of just people, we label these words and forget that actually these people, if we don't pay these people properly, how are they going to consume the very products that we made? Because right now we're incentivizing businesses to cut staff costs. And yet we forget it's the very same staff who are buying the products we're making. And so I think, and I hope that makes sense from my response, because I think that is one of the root causes, because we haven't figured out how to fully value for these things that are intangible, people and the environment. We haven't included it into the equation. We've forgotten about it. And this is how we're now seeing climate change and inequality come to the fore. That's how they're interlinked with each other. Yep.
Okay. And then we have a question from Esther. She asks, what would it take to restructure the national economies with a high priority on social inclusiveness for the most vulnerable?
I think if, again, my economist brain is working here, I think if we look at society, when we're helping the poor sector of society, I don't want governments to see it and businesses to see it as coming out of the goodness of their hearts. I want them to see it as an investment. Because if we can invest in good education, everybody having the same type of opportunities, if we can invest in healthcare and we can invest in environmental protection, yes, from an investment point of view, you're not going to immediately see the returns tomorrow or the next 3 years. You might see those returns in 40 years. But that investment is so worth it. In fact, there's been studies about education. If you invest in quality education, you will outstrip revenue coming out of just buying from bonds. As a society, we all will benefit if we make these sorts of social investments. So that's how I would say, from a national priority, instead of seeing it as, that's a cost. In order to deal with healthcare, in order to deal with education, that's a cost. I would change that mindset and say, no, it's not a cost. It's an investment. Because if you have a productive workforce with the right skill set and a healthy workforce and a critically thinking workforce, you will be better off in the long term.
We also have a question from Hyunjung No. Hyunjung, I can see you here. Would you please unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Ms. Lao. I just have one question. So I'm a third year medical student at Fudan University, and I would like to ask, how can we as students help to relieve this tension created by this perpetual cycle of economic inequality? And another one is just that, do you think protesting is an effective method of voicing our needs, or would you suggest a different method?
I think first question, thank you for your question. The first is definitely raise awareness. The more people who know about this, because every time I show this, people are just shocked. But then when they're shocked, they're like, because I can see some of you, you're like nodding. You're like, I now get why I'm so annoyed and I'm so frustrated. Because I don't think people actually quite see that there's a connection with the protests, civil protests, and inequality, and they're very connected. And also the capture of our political systems, that is also part of this whole issue about economic inequality. So if you can tell someone, like one person, if each one of you tells one or shares the presentation, you don't even need to share my presentation, but share it with someone, even with your parents. I mean, just telling your parents, do you know that my generation and the generation after me are going to be worse off than your generation, that is so powerful, because I don't think your parents want you to be worse off than them. And hopefully that will start a conversation with them. And the more people who understand how income inequality works, then it becomes a priority for national governments. That's the one. The second one, I think, sorry, can you say your second one?
The second one, just do you think protesting is an effective method of voicing our needs, and whether it's effective or not?
I understand why. Look, I'm a mom, okay? So if my kids are 10, I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. And when my kids don't like something, they don't actually protest, but they complain to me, right? So I understand from a human behavior perspective why young people want to protest. I understand. And because I can sense the anger and the frustration. Would I myself protest? It really depends on the situation, but I think don't just protest, vote. If you're in a country where you can do that, definitely do that, because voting is much more powerful than just protesting. But if you can't, you're not in a place, or you're not in a country where you can vote in the same way that a lot of democratic countries can do that. Find a way to involve yourself, or even, I would say, make a career out of trying to help businesses or help governments really make this a priority. In my case, I could have gone to work as an investment banker, and that's not a bad thing. Okay. It's just, it wasn't something that I felt was of transformational value to society. And I felt like my talent and skill set was better placed in helping change the system from within rather than from outside. Although I'm not saying that that's you, I'm just saying I'm more comfortable working inside and making those change inside. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Xu Zihan. Are you here? Would you please unmute yourself for this question?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Janice, for your presentation. And I actually, I'm recently doing a research on urban studies, trying to find out the impacts on coronavirus situation for the public. And I actually focus on the vendor economic policy in China right now, and try to figure out like what public's opinions on that. So in my research, I find it very interesting that most people actually hold a neutral and even opposing attitude to this kind of policy, because they believe that the government lacks a kind of regulation ability, and also this kind of policy actually cannot improve the economic situation for a large extent. So I want to hear your comments on this kind of vendor economic policy. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us grew up in learning that economics, you got to take care of yourself, don't increase minimum wage, all of these things that we were taught a certain way when it comes to economics. I'm one of them as well. But it's pretty staggering when you look at current data today. So all of this data that I just shared with you is just recent data. And so what Thomas Piketty actually said was we need to do more research, because in the past, economists only look at economic data without looking at social impacts. Yes. And then social scientists only look at the impacts without really figuring out what exactly is the root cause. And so what Thomas Piketty and his team have done, the research that they've done, and it's called, I think there's a website called World Inequality Database. What they're finding now is they're trying to get all of these social scientists and economists, even environmental scientists like myself, working together, trying to bring different pieces of the puzzle, because we don't actually see the full picture. So I understand if people say, oh, I don't believe in this policy, don't do that. Because I think a lot of people feel like, are you taking away money from me to redistribute? And my analogy is, if you remember my pizza pie with the small slice and the big slice, a lot of people feel like if we're talking about inequality policies, they're thinking, are you redistributing the small slice I already have from that slice? But we forget that we're not talking about that just small slice. We're talking about that whole pie that has to be redistributed. It's like we're fighting over crumbs as middle class people. And in fact, the real economy is bigger than the crumbs. We're actually talking about the whole pizza pie. So it's just a very difficult concept sometimes to grasp. And that's why I do these presentations with the visuals so that people can actually see it. Because if I just speak to them in a coffee shop, I don't think they'll immediately get it. But when I actually show them the data, that's when they see, oh, this is why it impacts me. So if I could convince them to change their mind, I would just say, if we can equitably distribute the economy, the wealth in the world, and I'm not saying equal fair, but I'm just saying like if we can do it in an appropriate way, all of us will win. We need all of us to win together. It's the same with the COVID. All of us have to wear a mask in order to deal with COVID. It's the same with the economy. All of us are in this together. If we have a poor sector of society, we will continuously have a situation where there will be civil strife, there will be protests, there will be political instability. So why not create a system where all of us will win? And the way to do that is through better economic policies that government has to put in place.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And then we have a question from Ashley. Ashley, hello, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, okay, Ms. Lao, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I learned a lot. It would be great if you could share your slides, if you don't mind.
I think Erica will be sharing
that would be amazing. I think a lot of people can benefit from that information. Okay, so I'm from Singapore. I'm a Yenching scholar at Peking University, and I study at Middlebury College and the National University of Singapore as well. Basically, I have two questions. So firstly, it's interesting that you brought up Singapore in your presentation because I'm from Singapore. And I know to a lot of people, it seems really positive, right? Like, oh, 90% of people have home ownership. But I think we often forget that actually much of the land and also the properties are actually owned by the government, and it's on a 99-year lease. But that's it. If effectively, functionally, it is owned by the people who own them. But that's it. And compared to Hong Kong, right? Like, so it does seem like a better situation, even though our top 10% own 70%. Exactly. So I mean, very interesting statistics. But I think my question with regards to that is then is it really possible to really replicate Singapore's system in other countries? Because a lot of people have argued that Singapore is such a small country, it's actually pretty much a city state. So is it going to work in bigger countries, where maybe the government doesn't have as much control over the country as Singapore does over many aspects of society? So I'd like to hear your opinion about that. And also for my second question, it's kind of related to Hyunjung's question earlier about what can we do, right? She asked what can we do as students. I mean, I was thinking more along the lines of what can we do as millennials, because as you have pointed out, I guess a lot of the Baishan scholars are millennials, or somewhere there. Or on a bigger level, what can we do on an individual level to actually, alleviate this problem of income inequality? How? I mean, there are all these solutions that you put in your final slide, right? Okay, increase women representation in the workplace, etc. But how can we really effectively do our little parts individually to make this problem better on a feasible level, day to day?
Right.
Thank you very much.
So no problem. On your first question on Singapore, I just put it up there, not saying Singapore is better, Hong Kong's better, whatever. It's just that even when Singapore has done a great job in terms of home ownership, and you're right, that's a 90-year lease or whatever, but it's still 70% of the Singapore economy is held by the top 10%. What are the 90% in Singapore doing with the rest of the wealth? 30%. Remember my pie?
Yeah.
You're fighting over that 30% of the pie when you should be fighting for the 100% of the pie,
Agreed.
not 30%. So even when Singapore tries to put in these policies, there's still gaps in their policy. And it is very difficult, I have to say. There are certain things that Singapore has done really well as opposed to other countries. And maybe that's only specific to Singapore. But what I'm saying is, even when these countries try, they still haven't quite cracked the nut, unfortunately. And I'm not sure why. A lot of it has to do with being courageous as a government, because a lot of these interests are so entrenched, right? They're so, like, we're talking about having to deal with a small group of people who have had such a high influence in that economy. How do you convince them to give a bit of what they have? And so that is, and I would say it will be different for each country, but I think it's also important for us to look at what other countries have done well. And then your second question about what you can do individually as a millennial, right? I know it's so frustrating because it's like, this is such a big problem and it's impacting you personally because you are a millennial. And as again, I will just repeat what I say. I challenge all you students to think about what are you going to do with your career? Because that's what I did when I was in the early 2000s. I thought, again, I could be a very rich lawyer litigating the top 1%, or I could be doing this. And this is what I've done with my life. I've decided that I'm going to do this. I'm going to dedicate my career to something of purpose. And it might take some time for me to actually see real change, but at least, one day when all of us have expiry dates in our head, one day when I'm in my deathbed, I'm going to think, you know what, I did everything with what was given to me, with my skill set, my talent. I did everything I could possible to help society. And that would be my challenge for you guys. And I know it sounds so airy-fairy, so like, so cheesy. There is no silver bullet. If the more people like you, and I'm sure the reason why you got your scholarships is because you are some of the most talented people in Asia, use it. Use that talent that was given to you and use it for the betterment of society. The talent and skills that were given to you is not for you to use alone. And if you remember what I said earlier, we all lose when we don't give the right opportunities to the most talented people in our society, because they might actually have the innovations, the intelligence to come up with these solutions. You are them. So please use the opportunities that you have in order to be, when you move up in your career, to really make a difference in the world, whether it's in education, whether it's being an economist, or maybe when you go back to Singapore, who knows, you might be the next prime minister. I don't know. Hopefully you'll remember this presentation and come up with these policies. So I think that is feasible in that sense. Start small. Think about, okay, what is my next career move? Will it be something that will help solve this huge problem?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. As we are running out of time, here is our last question from Rona. She said, is human nature to be selfish? When I don't have food on my table, how do I think about doing something to invest feeding others? Investing in the future good of a lot of people sounds very right, but what are the one or two major obstacles that are blocking the world from moving forward as one? And also another question from her, is socialism or communism the solution to income inequality? Capitalism, especially as we see it currently, but it doesn't seem to cut it.
Yeah. Rana is giving me a very difficult question. Yeah, so I'm not asking the poor or the middle class to solve this problem. I think a lot of economists are saying this is up to governments and businesses to work together to solve this problem. This is in their benefit. They are the ones who have the most influence and the most power to make this happen. I don't expect a poor person to give up. If they don't have food and then suddenly you go and say, oh, can I give away the last breakfast you had to someone else? Of course the answer is no. But what we're saying is we need government and businesses to use the tools that are in their toolbox to make it easier for society to move towards a more equal society. On the question about communism or socialism, I'm actually not about any of the isms. Communism has its flaws, so is socialism. I think what I'm just saying is we need to, because most of us live in a capitalist society, majority of us in the world do, so that's obviously our default. We need to redefine and reframe capitalism so that everybody benefits from it and not just a small few. The way the system is set up today is that it furthers the wealth of the top 1%. We need to stop that and allow the 99% to share in the benefits of that thriving economy, not just give it to the 1%. And again, just tying it back to Rana's first question, unfortunately, in this situation, we really need governments and businesses to help us get to that point. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Although it seems negative, it really takes us, it's very inspired and really make us think about what we should do to contribute to our society, especially we have our scholars. You're so gifted, maybe you can think about how to pay back to this society by using your talent. Thank you, Janice. Also, don't forget to read our website because all this information can be found from our website. And also please note that the recordings of some of our previous sections are already uploaded to this website. In case you missed our previous section, you can go back to our website and watch the replay. And please don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts, our Facebook, Instagram, and WeChat. And also don't forget our LinkedIn group, which is especially for our Baishan community. Lastly, I would like to thank you all of you for joining us today, and also Janice. I'll see you next time.